All right. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rachel Soicher. I'm an Associate Director of Research and Evaluation in the TLL. And just a huge thank you to all of you for being here today. This is our first speaker series event of the spring. And before I introduce today's speaker, I wanted to make sure that I announce our next speaker, which is going to be Dr. Robert Talbert, who's a professor of mathematics and senior faculty fellow for Learning Futures at Grand Valley State University. And he will be speaking with us about grading for growth toward more humane, authentic, and trustworthy ways to evaluate student work. And that speaker series is set to take place on March 18th from 3 to 4 p.m. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. We are really grateful to have Dr. Jill Allen joining us. Dr. Allen is currently an associate professor of psychology at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. She earned her PhD in psychology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And currently her research is focused on increasing gender, ethnic, and socioeconomic diversity within STEM fields with a specific emphasis on belonging interventions. And so if you would join me in welcoming Dr. Allen, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks to all the great folks at MIT for inviting me to this webinar. I'm really excited to be here today and share with you kind of the chronological journey of my research program that has focused on belonging and motivation and really using evidence-based practice that I've integrated from the research that I've done along with my teaching experiences. A quick note about the institutional context and the journey that I've taken to get here to Drake. I was delighted to take a look at your strategic action plan with a focus on belonging, keeping in mind that every institutional context is going to be different. So for example, what you see on the right, this is some local art that our first year students in the first year seminar at Drake put together. Similarly, we have a focus on our quality initiative for belonging. And I think these levers that facilitate some of the in-class experiences for belonging are really important to consider. And so, as always, keeping context in mind is really important. And I encourage you to do that throughout the talk with the suggestions that I can offer you today. So an overview of what I plan to cover today, very broadly speaking, I am interested in how student experiences through classroom and campus climate across domains impact student learning outcomes. This includes peer interactions. It includes, of course, our focus on pedagogy and teaching practices. But by and large, I am interested in two primary outcomes. And you'll see the interplay of these in the research studies that I present today, belonging and intrinsic motivation. Interestingly, as I go throughout this talk, I'm going to present to you 5 different domains where we can take a look at the theoretical aspect, the methodological aspect, and the applied aspect of how these different facets of processes, content, and context can make a difference in your classroom. And as we go through today's session, I'll encourage you to be thinking about 3 things that you could take away, 1 thing that you could do this week, 1 thing that you could do this semester, and 1 thing that you might plan to do strategically in the future. So I'll cover self-regulation of motivation, utility value, especially communal utility value, relationship building, communal instructional design, and then more systems level thinking on program development. And in true Drake tradition, we have a live Drake bulldog as our mascot. And so when we get to what I'm calling teaching translations, which will be the way that I would suggest you might consider incorporating some of this evidence-based practice into your own work, you'll see our local mascot, Griff, to help deliver some of these messages. Okay, so 1 caveat before we get started. Remember, and especially true coming from a social psychologist, that these strategies are meant to be customized. Everything that I will present to you should be embedded within a larger social context, and you're going to know that social context best for yourself. This crosses disciplinary, institutional, cultural, and historical contexts. A lot of the work that I have done, and perhaps many of you are focused in as well, will consider a STEM context. I would argue that some of these strategies could transcend STEM disciplines and are just good teaching practices. But a lot of the recommendations I'll give come from research in STEM. As I mentioned before, institutional context also matters. I think we're both lucky to be in a place where there is support for campus belonging initiatives. However, if that were not the case, some of these strategies would look different and would need to be enacted differently in those contexts. This is a very interesting cultural and political time, of course. We can think about underrepresented students' experiences when there are attacks from legislation, for example, on higher education and DEI. And so keeping in mind cultural context also matters in terms of the rollout of some of these strategies. And then finally, EAB reminds us that we are teaching every single day our generation pandemic students. Students who have come of age during the pandemic have 5 interesting characteristics about them. Mental health is a priority, more so than ever before. There may be some academic preparedness issues related to remote learning, for example, if students were affected in that way. They are seeking out real in-person experiences. So if they felt deprived of not being able to do the things they wanted to do during the pandemic, they're looking for that on a college campus now, more so than before, and that's really important to the work that I'll talk about today. They also are very tech savvy. They expect technology to be seamlessly integrated from start to finish in their college experience, including their career preparation. And lastly, they just want to know that their investment is going to pay off for college. And so all of these things are important to keep in mind with the way that we are interacting with students in the classroom. So to set the stage a little bit and talk about the role of STEM, I want to introduce some work on stereotype threat and provide some working definitions for the way that we might think about belonging. And so I want to start by describing the way that the STEM landscape is shifting. And so a lot of efforts to diversify STEM have been put in motion over the last 10 to 15 years. And you can see here that progress has been made from this data from National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. However, even though progress is being made in areas of sex and gender, race and ethnicity, and disability status, you can see that there are still disparities, for example, differential experiences for underrepresented groups, including women, students of color, and faculty and staff of color, as well as those who identify as having a disability. And so what does that mean for the overall workforce? Well, if you think about the STEM pipeline, here's data that comes from Ellis and colleagues in 2016. It takes a look at developmentally where this dropout from the STEM pipeline occurs. And so interestingly, you can see that in elementary school and early middle school, there are relatively equitable rates of interest in science. However, it seems to be something related to math, and it seems to be around 7th grade. And so there's this drop-off period, a critical period where interest and motivation goes down. And so you can see then there are fewer qualified individuals to contribute diverse ideas. And ultimately, the pool in the STEM pipeline is leaky in that way, so that by the time college education comes around and the STEM workforce is on the horizon, there is a very small proportion of those individuals who would have been eligible candidates earlier on before they hit that drop-off period. And so part of the focus that I want to take today is thinking about why that is. So what's the psychological experience of that as it relates to things like stereotype threat, and what can be done to mitigate some of those negative consequences? So that brings me to this influential model that will frame a lot of my talk today, that comes from Dustin Toman and Jesse Smith, who are both 2 of my postdoc mentors. And when we think about the way that this plays out, it impacts the 2 key outcomes that I've been mentioning to you: intrinsic motivation and the experience of belonging. And so I want to start by thinking about the contextual salience of stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is the anticipation that an individual who is underrepresented expects that they may be viewed through the lens of a negative stereotype. And so as a result, anxiety, psychological stress, and underperformance can occur as people are kind of navigating and monitoring the possibility that they might be viewed through that negative lens. And so that's the context for what we're talking about here. This prompts differential goal motivation and changes the very nature of the behavior and the experience that people have when they're doing a task related to science. Now, I'm very interested in the self-regulation of motivation and the phenomenological motivational experience pieces, because those are parts where there's agency among the participants. So they could change their behavior to regulate their motivation, and consequently then their intrinsic interest and sense of belonging might be affected. And so I think about this as a way in which we can capture the actual anticipated or sought experience of interest, which is how many scholars operationalize intrinsic motivation. Now, what about belonging? Belonging is a little bit harder to pin down, which is what I think makes it so interesting. And before I provide you a working definition that comes from literature, I want to ask you to imagine a classroom setting where you can, without having a definition, pinpoint that students feel that they belong. You're looking around and you can see it on their faces, you can see it in their nonverbal behavior, you can sense that there is a class community. Students seem to be exchanging insider information and they feel seen, heard, and valued, okay? With no definition, we can identify a time where that has happened. Just as easily, we can probably identify a time where we felt disconnected with students. Students felt disconnected from each other. And so it's very hard to pin down a definition because it changes moment to moment, and we can sense it more than we can describe it. That being said, we do have a couple of working definitions, which I'll offer here as working definitions for our talk today. Baumeister and Leary, as well as Susan Fisk, describe belonging as the core social motive on which other social motives are built, including things like power and control, which involve maintaining relationships with other people. That looks pretty different depending on the context that you're in. But subjectively, having a sense of inclusion, a sense of feeling that you are valued for who you are and that your identity is shared with others in the group and that you're understood, is a good place to begin. Now, I would like for us to personalize this a little bit as well. So think about the last time, either professionally or personally, that you embodied belonging. I'll give you about 20 seconds to kind of think through exactly what that was, what you were doing, and how it felt. And now I want you to think about what happened next, okay? Chances are it was fleeting, okay? So for me, the last sense of belonging that I had was a text message with my graduate school friend. We were sharing stories about our family and what we're doing in the summer and hoping to get together. Just as quickly as that text message was creating a sense of belonging and insider knowledge, we quickly turned and moved back to our families, and that sense of belonging was gone. Jeff Cohen, a superstar in belonging at Stanford, puts it best in his book on belonging. It is less like a keystone belief and more like a perception that's continually being recreated anew in every situation. And the truth is that that's exactly how our students feel as well. It's not that they belong chronically, but as they walk in and out of every situation, their sense of belonging is fleeting, it's momentary, and it's shifting. And so that's part of the challenge of doing research on belonging in this way. So let's get into the empirical evidence. If we're looking at studies that have pushed around motivation and belonging, can we draw on our overarching question? which was to try to enhance belonging and motivation through these key mechanisms in a way that we could improve our teaching practices. And so I'll start with the self-regulation of motivation, really as a process for which the learning occurs. And so I'm presenting here the very first study that I conducted, even under my maiden name, as a graduate student. This is about changing a task in order to make it more interesting when it's perceived to be boring, because there's a need to self-regulate. Now, this is a really interesting classic theory where Carol Sandstone and colleagues suggest that when there's a need, a good reason to do so, and available options, that you can actually mimic the way that people might regulate their behavior in a way to keep their interest up. Now, as you see in these images here, imagine that you're presented with just a block of letters and you're told that you're going to do a copy task. 2 minutes at a time for 3 times. Sounds pretty boring, right? And so if you were primed with a certain motivational mindset, as Tori Higgins calls regulatory focus, either a promotion or a prevention mindset, a promotion mindset may actually lead you to regulate your behavior more because you would be trying to change that task to make it more interesting. And as a result, you might persist longer on it. So promotion and prevention motivation are incredibly interesting because you can do things like ask people to list their hopes, feelings, and goals for promotion, or their duties and obligations for prevention. You can also do things like subtly prime this with a maze, where you can have a figure or a character like a mouse going toward cheese, which would be approaching a reward. Similarly, for prevention focus, you can have a mouse going away from a bird, for example, and that would be avoiding a negative outcome. And so as a result, in this study, we primed regulatory focus on this task at subtle, non-conscious, and overt levels, and then we measured how much they varied the task and their self-reported motivation for the task. And here's what we found across 3 studies as reported in this paper. These were all with college students, and they were mimicking a job setting. You can see that when there was a need, that is that the task was boring, and they were primed with a promotion mindset, that actually resulted in the most level of task variation. So they were regulating their behavior, and as a result, they reported higher motivation. What was interesting here is that there's a match between their behavior and their motivational mindset, and that's what ultimately led to a greater motivational outcome. And so what can you do with that information? So here's the first introduction of Griff, playing the piano here on campus. I want to introduce to you 5 ways in which you might consider modifying the task in your teaching. You can understand students' motivation for the course, getting a sense of if they will have approach or avoidance motivation, maybe with a pre-semester survey, so that you can try to target any regulation opportunities based on if they are coming into the course with approach or avoidance mindset, which we know we can prime and matters a great deal. It's also the case that in required courses, if a prevention focus is the default, which at my institution, a lot of times people are avoiding things like stats and research methods, you can capitalize on that through learning management system announcements, those informal conversations, and actually subtly prime the promotion focus, which would be more consistent with motivational outcomes for self-regulation. Providing recognition for students who are doing this spontaneously. So if they're creating games or study aids or in other creative ways regulating their behavior, you can acknowledge that. And then finally, use those students who are already doing that as a model for future students who could showcase and create opportunities for future students to benefit from that work. So if we've talked a bit about process, now let's talk about content. And when instructors are approaching a class, most often the first thing we go to is content, right? So we're experts in our field. And there's nothing wrong with approaching content, but I'm suggesting to us it's not the only tool in our toolbox. And so I'd like to focus now on the next strategy of communal utility value, which comes from a classic theory of expectancy value motivation. Expectancy value comes from Jackie Eccles and her colleagues, and it's really a multiplied function of people's expectancy for how well they will do on the task and what type of value they find in it. One of those types of values is utility value, and it can come in a few varieties. Communal utility value, which focuses on others, the way that you can help others, collaborate with others, or develop relationships, or agentic communal utility value, which you will be able to seek out power, achievement, and independence. And so multiplying those gets you task motivation. I want to share with you another study that I conducted with my colleague, Elizabeth Brown. And this was an opportunity to present NSF research, in this case, biomedical research that had to do with technology in a way that was high or low in communal values. So asking how it applies to the real world, or separating the aspects of communal value to see if a combined influence is more important than any individual aspect of pro-social, collaborative, or relationship-oriented. And then look to see how undergraduate students judge the research in terms of their positivity toward the science, how important they see that it is, and their career motivation. So this is part of a bigger paper. I'm just presenting two studies here. And you can see that the pattern is relatively comparable across the two studies with a couple of exceptions. So the more that participants were introduced or primed with the communal utility value of the research, that ultimately led to the best motivational outcomes in terms of seeing the research more positively and feeling excited about a science career. That was explained statistically in both cases by this perception of increased communal utility value. And importantly, in study 2, it was not the case that communal utility value led to lower perceived status or feminization of research, for example, because communal utility presentations were deemed to be positively related to research importance, which is good news. It doesn't actually deter people from perceiving the value of the research. There were very few gender differences in this effect too. And so men are not harmed in this intervention, rather everybody benefits. And that's good news for being able to frame the content in a way that increases motivation. And so back to ways that you can use this. If you want to apply utility value in your work, you can do things like application to the real world assignments. I do these in almost every class I offer, help them see real world applications that involve connecting with others, working for and with them, and building relationships. Consider adding assignments that require students to brainstorm societal impact, or what NSF or NIH has offered as their identified translational impact, and model this for students during lectures. Have students interview populations that have directly benefited from the research, maybe through community engaged learning. In a research setting, mentors could work directly with students to communicate the applied value and help students find the language to do that themselves. And then think creatively about graphic design. Podcasts, infographics, social media, all help students practice communicating the utility value to a broader audience. One of my very favorite assignments that I always do when there are campus events is provide extra credit. If students go to a speaker on campus with another member of the class, they have to take a selfie while they're there and then send it to me with something that they learned that connects back to the class. And an added bonus of that is they almost always post it on social media, which also influences social norms. Okay. So we focused a bit on process and content. Now I want to shift to the social context more specifically. So as we're thinking about the role of belonging, let me just pause for a moment and say that there are some assumptions that we've made so far. A lot of previous research, including my own that I presented today, makes assumptions about the intrapersonal nature of learning and also the perhaps limited interpersonal aspects that are impacting students. This could involve the kind of simulation that self-regulation of motivation is happening when students are alone, for example, which may or may not be true, that interpersonal aspects only occur from student to faculty member or staff member in a one-to-one relationship may also not be true, can happen in bigger class settings, and that the applications to society and community are only indirect in the social nature. And so if we limit it to that understanding, we are failing to account for the fact that other people in the learning environment can be a source of interest. And this is a really exciting idea that comes from Dustin Tolman and fuels the next line of studies that I'll talk about today. We wanted to know across 2 studies if building relationships in science is one way to facilitate communal perceptions and thereby increase women's motivation and persistence in STEM. So we conducted 2 high-impact Confederate-based studies, and in both cases, we manipulated stereotype threat with a flyer. So it's a subtle manipulation, but that's how a lot of stereotype threat manipulations are, where women are being talked to or talked over, they're not being well represented, and it's a very traditional or exclusive view of science. Then across studies, we manipulated the Fast Friends paradigm. So Fast Friends is a way in which you can facilitate a relationship in a very limited setting by asking questions back and forth that would be deeper in reciprocity. So first asking, if I ask Janet what she values most in a friendship, and then she might ask me, for example, and now we have this exchange where we are sharing information back and forth. And this goes on for a series of items. We compare that to 2 different control conditions, the same questions written in study 1 versus another comparison condition in study 2, small talk, things that are surface level, like, do you like to get up early or stay up late? All participants believed when they came to this study that they were doing a team dynamics of science study. And so we gave them the exact same science data transcription task that you saw in the previous study. They were given the opportunity to self-regulate on that task. And then afterwards, they completed individual self-report measures, getting at the belonging and motivation. Across these studies, we have men and women participants who are interacting with a male Confederate in study 1. We limited the sample to only women participants who are interacting with a female peer in study 2, but we kept a mixed gender dynamic by having a male experimenter. And here's just a sample of the items that were asked in the outcome measures. Drawing on the model that we've been thinking about before, we really wanted to add belonging to the mix. And so we asked about communal and agentic perceptions of the research. We also asked a static measure of belonging, a static measure of intrinsic interest in science. And then we looked at 2 different ways to think about persistence, either their behaviors, how many letters they're copying during that really boring transcription task, or their anticipated self-reported willingness to do that task more in the future. And so here's what we found. In study 1, remember, this is women and men. The path analysis is separated, so the dark lines represent the women's data and the gray lines below represent the men's data. Overall, we found that women reported more stereotype threat concerns compared to men, so the manipulation was effective. Contrary to predictions, we didn't find any effect of the Fast Friends manipulation. In fact, everybody felt included, and so although it was a null effect for the manipulation, it suggests to us that it's actually pretty easy to create a sense of relationship and community, which was a surprise, but also useful for a class setting. For women, we found that the more they perceived the task to be communal, it positively impacted belonging and interest. And the relationship between communal perceptions and persistence was statistically explained for women through the pathway of science interest. And you can see that that pathway does not hold for men, certainly doesn't hurt their science interest, but it does not explain their persistence. And now what about study 2? Remember, we're looking to replicate and extend and also change some of the comparison conditions to validate the effect. And so again, we see a similar pattern occur for women, where no impact of the Fast Friends manipulation, but the more they perceive the task to be communal, this positively impacts belonging and science interest. Science interest in turn predicts future persistence, but not behavioral persistence in this case. So that's one difference where the path did vary slightly. Once again, communal perceptions indirectly impacted future persistence via science interest. And so we're starting to see an interesting pattern that can explain that persistence among women in science domains. And so what does that mean in terms of what you could do with this information? Well, remember, the format of the relationship didn't matter. That's contrary to what we expected. And so we actually find that you can increase social connection in ways that seem pretty small, in any possible way you can think of. Think pair share, team projects, commenting on discussion posts. In fact, this data shows that other people really can serve as a source of interest, and it's not that challenging to do. Costs virtually nothing. Weak and strong ties are both effective. Because we didn't find an effect of our manipulation and we replicated that, we feel confident to say that the relationship building doesn't have to occur in a prescribed format. It can be even as simple as writing. It could look like developing a shared goal or class outcome in your syllabus. And it also could transcend time. So think about current students interacting with alumni, for example, or current students giving advice to prospective students. Okay. Again, men are not harmed by this manipulation. Everybody seems to benefit, but women particularly benefit, and we know that's important because of the underrepresentation. So why didn't belonging play the role that we thought it would? Well, there's a couple of different possibilities. Fast Friends in a laboratory setting is pretty artificially constructed. Real relationships in the real world take time. They have a history. And it's possible that in the context of a 1-hour setting, we couldn't generate an authentic relationship. It's also possible that it's methodological in nature, and that's where the last study comes in that I want to mention for you today. So in the beginning of today's talk, I mentioned how belonging as a construct is momentary and fleeting. However, a lot of the measures to date do not account for this. They talk about belonging as a chronic static experience in a context, like a science lab or like a class, and it doesn't allow for the possibility to move in and out of spaces and have those momentary fluctuations, just like we all recalled at the start of the session today. I adapted a tool called Life Data from Jason Runyon and programmed an app in which we could track science students' experiences, which I defined very broadly as lectures, labs, independent studies and research, co-curricular activities like study groups or organizations. Over the course of 2 weeks, we pinged them twice a day, asked them if they had had a science experience yet that morning. If they had, they were asked to quickly on their way to class respond to a couple of very brief items, like you see in the screenshots here, about belonging and motivation in that experience. So not retrospective, trying to get as close to the moment as we actually could. Then we also asked them in a short narrative section if they could reflect on what led to that positive or negative outcome, which we then later coded for intrapersonal or interpersonal experiences. At the end of the 2 weeks, we measured the dependent variables of interest, intrinsic science interest, and future science motivation. And so this is exciting because this is one of the very first times in the belonging literature that we're actually capitalizing on the construct as it actually occurs in the real world. And so this data is unpublished, hot off the press, so you're among the first to see it. Here's what some of the fluctuations look like. In this study, we had 116 students, about 62% white, 69% women, 30% first-generation college students, and about 51% first year. And their fluctuations in motivation and belonging, as reported in Life Data, are all over the board. On a scale from 1 to 7, you can see that in most cases, the range is being fully used. Standard deviations are almost a full point. And so students are fluctuating. And so it's those fluctuations that are of great interest to us. We can see that the relationship and predictive value of the belonging and motivation fluctuations are positively associated with those motivational outcomes. But what I think is so exciting here is that of the two predictors, belonging actually has stronger relationships with distal science interest and science motivation, and that does not differ across gender. And so for the first time, we're starting to see now the role of belonging as it's actually occurring to predict the positive motivational outcomes. Remember that we also asked for some qualitative data. I find this fascinating because I think it gives us insight into what we can capitalize on in the classroom. I've provided just two narratives here, de-identified, one that is more interpersonal and positive experience of belonging on the top, and a more intrapersonal, more negative experience on the bottom. And we added this actually partway through the study. And so we don't have full data on this from everyone, but we really wanted to try to understand how frequently those interpersonal experiences were coming up on their own. And the answer is not very often. So we only had 75 instances of interpersonal science experiences over the entire set of observations for the 2-week period. That came out to 1.5 science experiences that were interpersonal in some way per person over 2 weeks. So no more than 1 a week, which floored me. Another way that we can think about that is the total percentage of intrapersonal and interpersonal experiences. In total, we had 88% intrapersonal and only 12% interpersonal. And you can see that in the narratives that people provide here, very competing experiences. So if anything, I think that tells us that we ought to be doing more to cultivate interpersonal experiences into our instructional design. And so some ways that you could think about doing that include not underestimating the power of a good welcome message, taking time and doing that right, and developing class community in any way you can think of, whether that's polls, whether that's people hopping on their LMS, any ways that they can be connected to you and their peers. Try to anticipate when students might benefit from a social connection the most. Maybe it's during the first exam and when the grades come back. Maybe it's after midterm grades are posted. And be creative with grading tools. It can be even more interesting and fun from an assessment perspective to give personalized feedback using video or voice, and that can help increase connection and belonging because students will feel like you're actually in their corner, giving them a growth mindset. There are a lot of ways you can do this in low stakes activities. Offering options to revise and resubmit, for example, can be insightful as well. And try to build in data that would surpass what I found in my study, which is at least one opportunity for interpersonal interaction every week. It doesn't matter what it is, but it matters that you do it, and it matters that you're intentional about it. And so back to where we started here with the Thoman model of the motivational experiences of stereotype threat, I would also remind us that stereotype threat is not a one-time experience in which people never come back, right? They have an experience, it's more or less positive in nature. It impacts their motivation to persist, and that's ultimately going to change how they experience it the next time. And so with that in mind, we can start to think systematically about program level changes. And if you are an administrator in the room or you're a department chair or you are a campus leader in some capacity, this is where you might put some energy. You can think about prioritizing hiring and recruitment of diverse faculty, staff, and students as a way to showcase role models for the diversity in the sciences. Engaging in recruitment and retention initiatives that do not have to be large. They can be things related to faculty, staff, and student spotlights, for example. They can be support of affinity groups events, but it makes a big difference in terms of the opportunity to change the nature of the stereotype expectations. Marketing comes into play here. Like it or not, you can nullify stereotypes, and if you're not careful about it, they can actually be perpetuated as well. So using social media, for example, to promote shared experiences is a great way to build connection and reduce some of the stereotypes. If you have travel seminars or study abroad, it's a great place to do that and change the nature of what people think your science field might be. And then faculty and staff are strongly encouraged to get out, be visible, and support campus life that builds those authentic connections so that when students see you in the classroom, all of a sudden it's a different relationship. And so going back to where we started here, I've tried to offer for you today processes, content, and context solutions that can be implemented at individual, interpersonal, or systems levels. I hope that you have had a chance to think throughout this talk, which ones might resonate with you, which ones might work and why. And I would encourage you to try to think about taking away 3 things that would be possible. Doesn't mean that they'll work for sure, but it might give you a different way to cultivate motivation and belonging, which is always worth the effort. Some final thoughts as you do that. I presented to you the interventions that are near and dear to my heart. Of course, there are many more, and I'd be glad to provide additional references and reading if you're interested. Some popular ones that can be paired and partnered to maximize their effectiveness would be things like growth mindset among students or among instructors, even involving parents, for example, and social norms interventions. Another thing to keep in mind is that you saw in the data, sometimes these strategies are spontaneously adopted by students, those who maybe have more cultural capital or are savvy, but it's really an equity issue. And so if you know there's a strategy that's working, the instructor really has an obligation to provide an opportunity to scaffold that for all students. So just something to keep in mind. When you propose this idea of social interaction in the classroom, you have to ask yourself if you're willing to give up some predictability. Because as much as we would like to believe, not all social interactions can be controlled. They may not all be positive. So there's the potential for microaggressions. And so you want to be well-trained. You want to be prepared to collect feedback, to know how it's going. And if anything comes up that is a negative social interaction, you'll need to quickly monitor, address, and adjust. And keep in mind here that this is not one size fits all. So individual differences abound. A lot of research on communal and agentic goals looks at mean differences across first-gen students, women, underrepresented students, and low social class. However, you could make an argument that some of these strategies, for example, with collaboration, might work better for women relative to men. And so there's an emerging area of research that starts to look at intersecting identities for moderating factors. And going back to one last historical piece, keep in mind that these are still our generation pandemic students, and they will be here for a while. And so students are, at least on my campus and perhaps on yours, gaining more comfort in social settings, but there's still some hesitation. As Sherry Turkle reminds us, sometimes students are alone together, they're buried in their phone. And so some students may be less willing, less able, less confident to do these social interactions. And so that's where they really need our support. At the end of the day, I think the more that we can invest in our students, the more that we will really see that belonging and motivation go hand in hand. Ultimately, that leads to better retention, better student engagement, and better student learning outcomes. With that, I would like to thank a lot of my students who have been involved with this work at Drake University, as well as my collaborators, Jesse Smith, Dustin Tolman, Elizabeth Brown, Ivan Hernandez, and a past student who is a co-author on the paper I shared, Alexi Ginther, and you today for listening. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Jill. I really appreciate it. So we have one question in the Slido, which I'm going to start with just to reward folks for using the Slido. And if I can find it, sorry about this. Can you give a reference or say more about Sherry Turkle's conception of pandemic students being alone together?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sherry Turkle's book, actually, it's a lovely book, but it came out before the pandemic. And I've applied it in a way to think about the way that students are experiencing post-pandemic life. So I believe the original copy came out in 2017, and she's really describing technology over time, for example, with digitized pets, for example, or mechanical friends, taking the place of actual social interaction. And she makes a compelling argument that there is a preference sometimes to be alone, even when you're in the context of other people. And so imagine a student sitting in the classroom with their head buried in their smartphone, instead of doing the usual thing where you have chatter with your students around you. And sometimes that's a choice, right? It's also the case that you can be alone, but using technology in a way that is social media, your social network, and you can actually feel more connected psychologically, even though you are using technology and you're actually physically alone. And so I find this a really playful intellectual argument, because it really tells us that technology is at the heart of how students are experiencing belonging, and it's not going away. The modality might change, but I think this argument will hold for time to come, pre and post pandemic.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions. I had a question myself. You were talking about sort of students reflecting on when they felt belonging, say the one student in the living group with the fraternity and the other student in the classroom. But in cases with the fraternity, I mean, do those translate? That's a question, that's a situation where a student is feeling sort of general social belonging. And then how does that translate, influence, impact students' ability to feel like they academically belong in a particular course or discipline?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So there are additional measures of campus belonging, for example, that look at how often you engage in student life, for example, how many events you've gone to. And it's another layer of belonging. The way that I like to think about it is by building up resilience. So let's say you have a day where you blurt out the wrong answer in a class, or nobody wants to work with you in the class, or you've experienced kind of a belonging threat in the classroom. But maybe before that, maybe the night before, you had a positive interaction with your social group. And so maybe it doesn't knock you down as far, right? Or if you're thinking about recovery, let's say you have an experience where you do not get along with your faculty member or professor. And so maybe you don't feel comfortable going into office hours, but you find kind of support and rebuilding of your confidence in a different setting. And so I think there is opportunity for the literature to start to see belonging that might bolster or repair those threats across domains. And I think that's actually a really important part of the belonging experience on a residential college campus, because the student's day doesn't end when the classes are over, right? And that could look different, of course, if it's a non-residential campus as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. We do have a little bit more time, and we can take some questions. If you raise your hand, I can call on you, or again, feel free to write it in the chat and slide, or in the Slido if you'd like, prefer.
I'd also be really curious if any of you have tried any of the strategies that I brought up, and if you had any success with them, or if you felt there were some challenges.
Oh, we have a question. John?
Hey, Jill, I really like that. That was great. I guess related to your last question, one of the neat things about your talk is there are a lot of things I've just adopted from the point of view of active learning and trying to improve outcomes. But like, I love how that belonging gives this overarching framework of having students do, think pair shares and in-class activities. And I guess another thing I've done, just because I always thought it was silly and fun, but I realized might be impacting belonging, is like, I teach a class in signals, and so most of our work began with Joseph Fourier, and I often like buy a Fourier birthday cake for his birthday and bring it to class. And like, I just did it because it was the kind of goofy thing that, I was a student at MIT for years, and some of my instructors would do silly things like that, or just, tell little stories in class about the scientists as much as the real world connection. So I like that this gives me a framework maybe to think about, that there is more value to some of this sort of just making it fun in terms of belonging and future motivation. So I guess that's some of the things I've tried that fit with what you say. And students seem to like the class, and they mentioned that makes the class more fun. And they like the active learning more than me lecturing anyways, right? So
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, John. It's interesting because I think what I always come back to is the idea of authenticity. So if you're on point, if you're on script, if you're structured all the time, it's hard to know what your authentic personality is. And so when you get off script and you bring in the cake, or you laugh with the students, or you have an interaction that is a little bit non-traditional, that actually creates an entirely new dynamic that I would argue is like a domino effect. And so I think that's great that, you have built in those traditions. And what's interesting is that it's all kind of individually dependent too, right? So maybe it wouldn't work as well for me to bring in a cake, but maybe I could do something different. And so we all have to kind of personalize this and find the way it works for us.
Great. Amanda?
Yeah, thanks. This is great. I love all of this stuff about research and all these things. It's my favorite. Thank you for coming and giving this talk. In my classes, I often do semester-long groups, like working groups. So they have to come back to each other again and again and again. And it's funny because sometimes it works better than I could ever imagine. And these groups, like they have to name themselves, they have fun with it, they like start supporting themselves outside of the classroom, like all that kind of stuff. It makes such a big impact. And sometimes it like spectacularly fails and none of the groups really end up congealing. And so I wondered if you had any insight into, I just feel like it's, also random, but I wonder if you had any insight into like what makes those things successful in the moment and what doesn't work so well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I've had both of those too. So I don't think being a belonging researcher gives me, anything special that maybe you wouldn't have. Sometimes what I often do is lay out very clearly my vested interest, so laying out the process. And I have found that if I gloss over that step, or if I let go a little bit on the accountability, it's in those moments where the students, they don't see the value. And so maybe it actually goes back to the utility value piece of it a bit. I'm asking you to do this explicit step in your group project for this reason, because it helps you with career preparation. And sometimes the idea of you'll have to work with people in your future job, which I've used before, it falls a little bit flat. Students want more than that. And so I think the more that you can connect the tasks in the group project to something that they would find value in the real world. Maybe that's an intervention, for example, or maybe that's a policy change or whatever it is in your field. And then kind of bring them along with the motivation that the group work is important for that reason. And then pair that with all the things you're probably already doing around accountability and transparency. And I think that's where I often find a little bit of success, and might be something that would be useful for you too.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Great. We're aware we're past the MIT end, but we can stay on for a few more minutes. Obviously, if you have to leave, we understand. We can take one or two more questions, maybe, depending on how involved they are. If you have any. Okay, then I guess we'll wrap up. Let's thank the speaker one more time. I don't have a virtual hand, but thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And we will circulate the information from the talk after we've processed it all. And we look forward to just learning more about your research, Jill. And if you have any questions, just reach out to tll@mit.edu if you want more information. And don't forget our upcoming March talk, which is information is available on our website. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everyone.